If you've ever looked at a 24% credit card rate, a payday loan that doubles in months, or a small business loan that feels impossible to service, you've probably heard the explanation. Greedy lenders, predatory banks, criminal interest rates. We call it usury, and we treat it like a moral disease. But what if high interest rates aren't the disease? What if they're the symptom? What if government policy reshaped the system so completely that high rate lending became the only form of lending that can survive? Because in a healthy system, lending is boring. Rates fall, capital competes, and patience wins. In ours, patience gets punished. Usury isn't the cause, it's the residue. I'm Parker, and on today's episode of The Government is the Problem, we're looking at lending and how policy made expensive credit inevitable. In a production based economy, lending is boring. That's important. Most loans aren't glamorous. They fund equipment, payroll, inventory, and expansion, not yachts. Capital is lent to buy machines, train workers, expand output, and build things that last. Returns are modest, predictable, and long term. As production creates real value, capital becomes abundant. When capital is abundant, lenders compete. They compete on lower interest rates, better terms, and longer horizons. Not because they're virtuous, but because they're afraid of losing good borrowers. That's what healthy lending looks like: competitive, dull, and unremarkable. Now enter inflation. Simply put, inflation means money loses value over time. Interest rates stop being about profit and start being about capital preservation. Interest must now cover time, risk, and inflation. If inflation is unpredictable, lenders must also price in uncertainty, and uncertainty is expensive. That alone pushes rates upward. But inflation doesn't just raise rates, it destabilizes long term lending first. A lender cannot safely lend cheaply over 10 or 15 years when the currency itself is unpredictable. The longer the time horizon, the greater the risk of quietly being eroded. Patience becomes dangerous. If inflation wasn't bad enough, taxation hammers lenders even more. Income taxes treat interest as if inflation doesn't exist. Interest is taxed nominally, not in real terms. So let's make this simple. You lend $100 at 10%. At the end of the year, you receive $10 in interest. If inflation was 3%, the purchasing power of your original $100 fell to about $97 in real terms. Only 7 of that 10 represents real gain. The other 3 merely restores what inflation eroded. But the federal corporate tax rate is 21%, so the government takes about $2.10 of the original 10, and that's before state corporate taxes come in. Now you're left with roughly $7.90. Subtract the $3 that simply kept you even with inflation, and your real gain falls to under $5. And that's from a 10% loan. And if inflation rises to, say, 6, 7, or even 8%, that margin compresses quickly. At some point, the lender isn't earning a real return at all. They're just losing purchasing power more slowly. That's not a tax on profit, it's a tax on staying whole. Interest is usually relent. That's how lending pools grow and rates fall over time. When inflation is taxed as income, less capital remains to lend, the pool shrinks, and cheap long term credit becomes fragile. With all of that factored in, lenders face a simple reality: lend cheaply and risk losing to inflation and taxes, don't lend and lose to inflation anyway, or lend expensively and preserve capital. Only one option consistently survives. So lending moves to shorter time horizons, higher rates, and collateral heavy or consumer credit. Not because lenders became evil, but because policy selected for this behavior. So, what about large creditors? How does this affect them? Large institutions survive because they can navigate regulation, access central credit facilities, and hedge against policy risk. Anyone who is smaller lacks the legal and financial resources to navigate the system. So, credit centralizes, rates rise, and the public blames greed while ignoring the system pressures that made expensive credit the rational strategy. This isn't a morality play, it's incentive design. Calling modern lending usury is a mistake. The real issue isn't immoral lenders. It's that government policy debased money, taxed nominal returns, and punished long term capital formation. In a production based system, competition would force rates downward over time. Here, competition was strangled upstream. When you debase money and tax inflation as income, cheap credit doesn't disappear because people have become greedy. It disappears because it becomes unprofitable. Usury isn't the cause, it's what survives when the system selects for nothing else. This is Anvil Hammer Forge. Let's get to work.